Picture this: a kingdom at the height of its power, its borders guarded by towering castles and loyal armies, only to wake one day and find its lifeblood gone. Not plundered by invaders or scorched by war, but vanished without a trace, the rivers that once fed its farms, fueled its trade, and defined its boundaries had simply disappeared. This wasn't the plot of a fantasy novel, it was the shocking reality for medieval kingdoms across Europe and beyond, where the silent, relentless shift of waterways redrew maps and rewrote destinies. Today, we're unraveling one of history's most overlooked forces of change, the lost rivers that toppled empires. These waterways weren't just lines on a map, they were the pulse of civilization. A river's path decided where crops would flourish, where cities would rise, and where kings could stake their claims. But when those rivers changed course or dried up, the consequences were catastrophic. Alliances forged over generations crumbled overnight. Borders painstakingly defended for centuries became meaningless, and kings who'd spent their lives preparing for battle suddenly found their greatest enemy wasn't the army across the valley, it was the earth itself, shifting beneath their feet. How could something as simple as a river's whim alter the course of history so dramatically? The answers lie buried in forgotten maps, crumbling treaties, and the stories of kingdoms that vanished with the waters they depended on. This is a tale of human ambition colliding with nature's unpredictability. It's about maps that held secrets even their makers didn't understand, and borders that moved not by conquest, but by the slow, silent work of erosion and time. By the end of this journey, you'll see medieval history in a whole new light, not just as a series of battles and betrayals, but as a dance between power and geography, where the land itself was a silent player in every king's strategy. So let's trace these vanished waters together, from the fertile valleys they abandoned to the wars they sparked, and discover how the ghosts of lost rivers still whisper in the boundaries we recognize today. To grasp just how much rivers shaped medieval kingdoms, imagine them as the ancient world's internet carrying not just water, but information, wealth, and power. Every major city from London to Constantinople clung to riverbanks like lifelines. These waterways were nature's highways, moving goods 10 times faster than ox carts bumping over muddy roads. A single barge could carry the grain harvest of an entire village, making rivers the economic engines of their age, but their influence ran deeper than commerce. A king's control over a river meant control over trade tariffs, military supply lines, even the flow of news. When a monarch like Charlemagne commanded the Rhine, he didn't just own the water, he held the keys to an empire. Yet rivers were also fickle allies. Unlike stone walls or sworn oaths, they answered only to the laws of nature. The Po River in Italy, for example, famously shifted its course in the 12th century, leaving the bustling port of Ferrara stranded inland almost overnight. Suddenly, a city that had been a maritime power found its docks rotting in a field of reeds. Trade routes collapsed, tax revenues evaporated. Neighboring lords who'd once bowed to Ferrara's wealth now saw weakness and seized the opportunity to redraw borders by force. Similar disasters played out along the shifting channels of the Loire in France, where castles built to guard river crossings found themselves marooned in swamps, their strategic value washed away with the current. The most cunning rulers treated rivers like living chess pieces. When the Danube's tributaries began silting up in Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus didn't just mourn the loss. He hired engineers to dredge new channels, deliberately steering the river to starve rival towns of water while enriching his own land. In England, the Thames became such a political tool that medieval parliaments passed laws forbidding lords from altering its flow. Because in a world where maps were more aspiration than accuracy, a river's path wasn't just geography, it was a statement. When the Dnieper River shifted eastward in Kievan Rus, it didn't just move water, it moved the border between Orthodox and Mongol spheres of influence, rewriting alliances that had stood for generations. What made these waterways so politically explosive was their dual nature, both boundaries and bridges. A river like the Elbe could be a defensive moat one day and an invasion route the next, depending on who controlled the fords and ferries. Winter freezes turned frozen rivers into highways for Viking longships, while summer droughts exposed shallow crossings where armies could strike. The Seine's meandering loops created natural no-man's lands between French and English territories during the 100 Years' War, with castles built on vanishing sandbars that disappeared beneath the floods. These weren't just changes to the landscape, they were shifts in the balance of power, written in water and mud. Perhaps no example proves this better than the strange case of the Zwin River in Flanders. What began as a minor channel silted up over decades, strangling the once mighty port of Bruges. As ships could no longer reach its docks, wealth flowed instead to Antwerp, rewriting the economic map of Northern Europe. The Dukes of Burgundy, whose fortunes were tied to Bruges, found their influence draining away with the receding waters, a reminder that in medieval politics, even the mightiest rulers bowed to the whims of rivers. Because when the waters moved, they didn't just change the land, they changed the rules of the game. The disappearance of a river could unfold like a slow-motion tragedy or strike with the suddenness of a lightning bolt. Take the Rhine, Europe's mighty artery, which once branched into multiple channels across the Low Countries. Over centuries, silt built up like a clogged vein until entire distributaries withered away. Towns that had thrived as trading hubs found their harbors stranded miles from flowing water, their economies crumbling like the dried mud beneath their docks. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Arno River near Florence could vanish almost overnight after heavy rains, its waters swallowed by porous limestone caverns. One season, farmers would be irrigating their fields. The next, they'd be digging wells in a dusty riverbed, while rival city-states jostled to claim the newly exposed land. Medieval mapmakers faced an impossible task. Without satellites or aerial surveys, they relied on traveler accounts and outdated sketches, leaving vast stretches of parchment blank or scribbled with warnings like, "Here be shifting sands." These gaps became breeding grounds for deception. A lord might commission a map showing his territory firmly anchored to a river's traditional course, conveniently ignoring that the water had moved decades earlier. When two kingdoms disputed a border, each would produce maps with rivers artfully redrawn to favor their claims. In one notorious case, the Duke of Burgundy and the Holy Roman Emperor nearly went to war over a bend in the Meuse River that had straightened itself out, leaving a rich tract of farmland suddenly up for grabs. The Rhine's wanderings were especially chaotic. During the Great Flood of 1342, the river abandoned its main channel near Strasbourg, carving a new path overnight. Dutch merchants who'd built their wealth-controlling tolls along the old route watched helplessly as trade shifted to the new waterway now in the hands of their rivals. Further upstream, castles that had guarded strategic crossings for generations now stood useless, their moats reduced to grassy ditches. The river's betrayal was so complete that local chroniclers wrote of it as a divine punishment, as if the water itself had chosen sides in human conflicts. Then there were the rivers that didn't just move, they vanished entirely. In Central Asia, the Amu Darya's sudden diversion in the 12th century starved the Khwarezmian Empire of irrigation, weakening it just as Genghis Khan's armies approached. Closer to home, England's mysterious lost river of Sorbrook disappeared into sinkholes during the Wars of the Roses, leaving entire villages without water. Opportunistic nobles seized the chaos to redraw boundaries, knowing that thirsty peasants wouldn't have the strength to resist. Even nature's smallest acts, a landslide blocking a tributary, a beaver dam rerouting a stream, could unravel decades of careful diplomacy. Because in a world where borders were often just as far as a man could ride before lunchtime, the absence of a river didn't just erase a line on a map, it erased the very idea of order. The cruelest twist, some rivers returned as abruptly as they left. After generations of fighting over the dry bed of the Tagus in Spain, floods in 1580 suddenly restored its original course, drowning the farms and forts that had encroached on its forgotten path. It was a reminder that while kings might draw borders, rivers would always have the final say. In the hands of ambitious rulers, a map wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. Imagine two kings standing over a parchment, each pointing to the same river but seeing entirely different borders. One insists the waterway marks the edge of his domain, while the other swears it bends 10 miles east, conveniently placing a rich trading town in his grasp. Neither is lying outright, they're just using maps drawn in different centuries when the river's course hadn't yet shifted. This wasn't cartographic confusion, it was strategy. Medieval rulers quickly realized that outdated maps could be wielded like swords, slicing territories away from rivals with nothing more than ink and audacity. During the 100 Years' War, both English and French monarchs exploited this chaos. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 supposedly fixed borders by tying them to rivers like the Somme. But when those rivers meandered, so did the claims. English commanders would arrive with century-old charts showing their right to a fortress now stranded on the wrong side of a new channel, while French officials brandished freshly drawn maps proving the land had always been theirs. The result, battles fought not over gold or glory, but over faded lines on rotting parchment. In one infamous clash near Bordeaux, soldiers died disputing a ford that hadn't existed for 50 years, their blood-soaking ground made worthless by the river's quiet retreat. Italian city-states turned map fraud into an art form. Venice's secretive cartographers produced dual sets of charts, accurate ones for their merchants, and altered versions for rivals, with key estuaries misplaced just enough to steer Geno's ships into sandbars. Florence and Pisa waged a paper war over the Arno River's path, each hiring scholars to rediscover ancient Roman maps that miraculously supported their claims. The worst offenders were the Papal States, where bishops used doctored maps to seize farmland after floods changed river courses, declaring the shifts acts of God, conveniently favoring the Church's interests. The stakes grew even higher when rivers weren't just boundaries but lifelines. Control a waterway on a map, and you controlled the right to tax every barrel of wine or bale of wool floating downstream. Burgundy's dukes famously redrew the Scheldt River's tributaries on official documents, granting themselves toll rights over ports that physically lay in Brabant. When challenged, they'd produce a beautifully illuminated and utterly fictitious 12th century charter, proving the river had always flowed that way. By the time hydrologists could debunk the claim, the Duke's coffers were already full. These weren't just petty squabbles. In 15th century Germany, a feud over a single bend in the Weser River escalated into the Weser War, where knights in armor clashed over which version of a 200-year-old map was authentic. The conflict only ended when the river itself settled the debate, changing course again during a flood, rendering both claims obsolete. It was a brutal lesson. In a world where geography was fluid, even the most carefully inked borders were written in sand. And as long as kings prized land over truth, the maps they wielded would continue to rewrite history, one disputed line at a time. Cartographers held more power than most generals in the medieval world because while swords could win battles, maps won wars. These weren't just men hunched over parchment with quills. They were master manipulators of reality, often serving as spies, diplomats, and even saboteurs. Take Gerardus Mercator, the famed Flemish mapmaker who secretly coded strategic river crossings into his celestial charts for Habsburg military campaigns. Or the anonymous Venetian water scribes who deliberately misplaced islands in the Adriatic, luring Ottoman ships onto reefs. For every honest surveyor measuring the land step by step, there was another paid to nudge a river's course just enough on paper to gift his patron a vineyard, a mine, or an entire province. The most cunning cartographers played both sides. Pietro Visconti, Genoa's premier mapmaker in the 14th century, sold nearly identical Portolan charts to rival maritime republics but with critical differences. To Venice, he'd exaggerate the depth of the Po Delta, encouraging larger trade ships to risk shallow waters and run aground. To Pisa, he'd shrink the distance between Corsica and Sardinia, setting up naval collisions in contested straits. These weren't mistakes, they were traps inked in sheepskin, and when caught, Visconti simply blamed travelers' accounts, knowing no one could prove otherwise in an age without satellites. But the true power brokers were the monastic cartographers, quiet monks in remote scriptoria, who redrew the world according to divine politics. At Reichenau Abbey on Lake Constance, Brother Hermann's Mappa Mundi subtly shifted the Rhine's tributaries to place church lands strategically upstream from rival lords. When floods later followed those very channels, the abbey claimed it as divine favor and demanded tithes from newly water-starved villages. Meanwhile, in Canterbury, scribes working for Archbishop Thomas Becket doctored Thames estuary maps to show royal manors encroaching on sacred grounds, sparking a feud with King Henry Roman II that ended in martyrdom and sainthood. Not all mapmakers bent the truth willingly. Arabic geographer Al-Idrisi faced a chilling ultimatum when Sicily's King Roger Roman II demanded a world map, glorify Norman territories or lose his hands. The resulting Tabula Rogeriana became a masterpiece of subtle defiance, accurate latitudes for Christian cities, but exaggerated river widths in Muslim lands, making them appear more fertile and inviting invasion. Other cartographers paid dearly for honesty. Burgundian surveyor Jacques Le Rouge was blinded after correctly charting the shifting Meuse River, robbing his duke's cousin of 12 square miles. His crime, proving the land wasn't stolen, it had simply floated away on the current. The fragile dance between truth and deception reached its peak during the Council of Constance in 1418, where two maps of the same Danube bend triggered a diplomatic crisis. The Holy Roman Empire's version showed the river bulging east, granting them a key fortress. Hungary's map had it bowing west, placing the stronghold in their grasp. When neither side could agree, they did what medieval powers often did. They split the difference and burned the original surveys, ensuring no one could ever prove who was right. It was cartography as theater, where rivers didn't just flow with water, but with ink, gold, and blood. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the rare maps that resisted manipulation. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, commissioned by a king but crafted by a Jewish cartographer forbidden from holding power, remained stubbornly accurate, even when it revealed Christian strongholds as vulnerable to Moorish raids. Its creator, Cresques Abraham, knew the truth wouldn't make him rich, but it might keep sailors alive. In the margins, he drew mermaids pointing to shifting sandbars and dragons marking river mouths prone to silting, not fantasy, but covert warnings. Because in an age where kings saw maps as deeds of ownership, the greatest subversion was to remind them, nature keeps its own records and water always finds its way. The Loire River, France's longest waterway, was supposed to be a shield, a natural barrier protecting the heartland from invaders. Instead, it became a traitor in slow motion. Year after year, its floods gnawed at the land, swallowing castles whole and redrawing the frontier between French and English territories like a scribe with a grudge. By the time the 100 Years' War erupted, the Loire wasn't just a river. It was a weapon wielded by geography itself. Take the fate of Château de Somme, a fortress built to command a strategic bend in the river. For decades, its thick walls defied armies, but no one could armor it against the Loire's patience. Spring floods in 1341 undercut its foundations, collapsing an entire tower into the current. English commanders watching from across the valley didn't need spies to report the damage the river had done their reconnaissance for them. Within months, they'd forded the newly shallow channels where the Loire had abandoned its old bed, establishing a bridgehead that would haunt France for generations. The Loire's betrayals weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they unfolded inch by inch. Near Orléans, silt deposits built up so gradually that French sentries didn't notice the river creeping northward until English archers appeared on what had been their side of the bank. By then, it was too late to protest. The water had already rewritten the border. Even Joan of Arc's legendary relief of Orléans in 1429 hinged on the river's whims. Her convoy of supplies barely made it through newly formed sandbars, while English reinforcements found their usual landing spots submerged. What made the Loire uniquely dangerous was its unpredictability. Unlike the steady Thames or the reliable Seine, this river had a personality: violent floods one year, droughts the next. French kings couldn't decide whether to treat it as an ally or a foe. When they built forts along its banks, the Loire drowned them. When they withdrew, it left fertile plains undefended for English raids. The river became a chessboard where the pieces moved themselves, and France was always a move behind. The final insult came in 1451, when the Loire's spring surge carved an entirely new channel near Angers, bypassing 3 critical French toll stations overnight. The royal treasury lost 1/3 of its annual river taxes in a single season, while English merchants suddenly found a tax-free highway straight into French markets. It was economic warfare by geological accident and proof that in the medieval world, even the land could switch sides. The Danube Delta was supposed to be Hungary's greatest defense, a sprawling maze of waterways too treacherous for Ottoman armies to navigate. But by the 16th century, the river had other plans. Silt deposits built up like sand in an hourglass, choking old channels and carving new ones in unpredictable patterns. What once was a reliable barrier became a shifting puzzle, where fortresses built to guard strategic crossings suddenly found themselves stranded in swamps, their garrisons useless against enemies who now had entirely new paths to strike. Hungarian engineers had constructed a network of riverside strongholds, stone sentinels like Visegrad and Esztergom, positioned to control every major ferry point. But as the Danube's branches wandered, so did the front lines. In 1526, Ottoman scouts discovered a previously unknown channel near Mohocs, bypassing Hungarian defenses entirely. The result was a massacre. King Louis Roman II cavalry, trained to fight on familiar ground, floundered in unfamiliar marshes while janissaries attacked from dry land that hadn't existed the year before. The battle didn't just decide a war, it erased a kingdom. By sunset, Hungary lay shattered, its fate sealed not by superior tactics, but by a river that had redrawn the battlefield overnight. The Ottomans learned the Danube's treachery soon enough. After conquering Buda in 1541, They spent decades rebuilding its fortifications only to watch the river creep westward, leaving their shiny new walls half a mile from the water's edge. Supply boats ran aground on freshly formed sandbars. Siege engineers found their carefully plotted angles useless when moats filled with reeds instead of water. Even the mighty Suleiman the Magnificent couldn't outmaneuver a delta that reshaped itself with every flood. His grand invasion of Vienna in 1529 faltered partly because the Danube's main channel, critical for hauling cannons, had split into 3 shallow threads, none deep enough for his heavy barges. Local fishermen and ferrymen became unlikely power brokers in this liquid chess game. They alone knew which channels still carried water after each spring melt, selling their knowledge to the highest bidder. A Hungarian spy disguised as a boatman once led an entire Ottoman supply convoy into a dead-end tributary, where waiting partisans picked them off like ducks in a barrel. In response, the Turks began employing their own river pilots, only to find that the Danube's deception ran deeper than human trickery. One Ottoman chronicle tells of a scout who swore a certain route was navigable, having used it weeks prior. By the time the army arrived, that channel had vanished, replaced by a sandbar thick with willows. The delta's most brutal irony came in the 17th century, when Hungarian rebels fighting Ottoman rule deliberately breached dikes to flood Turkish camps, only for the waters to change course mid-battle, drowning their own forces instead. It was a fitting end to a century of conflict where rivers didn't just reflect borders, but actively toyed with them. Today, satellite images show the Danube Delta still creeping seaward at a rate of 60 feet per year, as if carrying the echoes of those old wars in its current. The water never chose sides, it simply followed gravity, leaving kings and sultans alike to learn the hard way. In the game of empires, geography holds all the cards. The Po River didn't conquer lands with swords or sieges, it used something far more powerful: time. For centuries, this lazy, meandering waterway slithered across northern Italy like a serpent reshaping its nest, silently transferring villages, farms, and even entire duchies from one ruler to another. While kings signed treaties and diplomats haggled over parchment borders, the Po was busy rewriting reality under their feet. Take the fate of Ferrara, a jewel of the Este family's dominion. In the 12th century, the city thrived as a bustling port where Venetian galleys unloaded spices and silks directly into its warehouses. But as the Po's southern branch began silting up, the river's main current nudged northward inch by inch, year by year, until Ferrara's docks stood stranded in a field of reeds. The Estes woke one day to find their maritime empire had become landlocked, while their rivals, the Gonzagas of Mantua, suddenly owned a new deep water channel they'd never fought for. No armies marched, no trumpets blared, just the quiet gurgle of water choosing a new path. This was border warfare by geological stealth. As the Po's delta fingers crept eastward, they dragged entire legal jurisdictions with them. A farmer might go to bed a subject of the Duke of Modena and wake up owing fealty to the Republic of Venice, all because the river had redrawn the property line overnight. Tax collectors from rival states would arrive at the same field, each waving conflicting maps, one showing the old riverbed as the border, the other the new channel. The poor peasant caught in the middle often paid both or fled. The most audacious power play came from Milan's Visconti dynasty. When they noticed the Po's gradual shift toward Mantuan territory, they secretly funded peasant crews to dig diversion canals, not to stop the river's movement but to accelerate it. By the time Mantua's scouts realized what was happening, the Po had carved a permanent new course, placing 12 miles of prime farmland under Milanese control. When challenged, the Viscontis simply shrugged and produced a 50-year-old map, proving the river had always flowed there. Nature, after all, had done their dirty work. Even the church wasn't immune to the Poe's whims. The Bishop of Cremona once lost an entire diocese when the river abandoned its western branch, leaving his cathedral on the wrong side of the border. His desperate appeals to Rome invoked divine intervention, but the water kept flowing where it pleased. Meanwhile, downriver in the Venetian lagoon, doges watched with satisfaction as the Poe's sediments built new islands they could claim, all while the river slowly strangled rival ports. The final irony: the very engineers hired to tame the Po often accelerated its betrayals. 15th century attempts to straighten its bends with levees only made the current more powerful downstream, where it chewed through softer soils and jumped its banks elsewhere. Like a chess player sacrificing pawns, every intervention to control the river in one place created vulnerabilities in another. By the time Napoleon marched into Italy, the Po had rendered entire generations of border treaties meaningless, its waters proving that in the game of empires, nature always holds the winning hand. Rivers didn't just mark the edges of kingdoms, they marked the boundaries between heaven and earth. To medieval believers, waterways like the Jordan, the Ganges, or the Rhine weren't merely geographic features. They were sacred thresholds where the divine touched the mortal world. When these rivers shifted, they didn't just redraw maps, they rewrote holy itineraries, upended centuries of tradition, and sparked clashes between faiths as fierce as any war. Take the Jordan River, Christianity's most hallowed waters. For pilgrims trekking to the Holy Land, baptizing themselves in its currents was the culmination of a lifetime's devotion. But when earthquakes in the 12th century diverted its southern tributaries, the river's course near Jericho shrank to a trickle. Suddenly, the very spot where Jesus was said to have been baptized lay stranded in a sun-baked gully. Crusader kings and local bishops scrambled to redefine sacred geography, with rival factions declaring new stretches of the riverbank as the true site, not out of piety, but because controlling the pilgrimage trade meant controlling a fortune in alms and offerings. In India, the Ganges carried even greater weight, not just as a border, but as a goddess. Hindu rulers measured their legitimacy by their ability to protect her flow. When the river's main channel shifted eastward in the 14th century, abandoning the holy city of Kanauj, the reigning dynasty didn't just lose territory, they lost the mandate of heaven. Rival kings seized the moment, proclaiming that the Ganges had chosen their lands, branding themselves as her new guardians. Pilgrims who'd walked for months to bathe in Kanauj's waters now found themselves redirected to rival temples downstream, their offerings filling the coffers of upstart princes. Faith, it turned out, flowed as unpredictably as the rivers themselves. Even in Europe, where rivers were less overtly deified, they shaped religious power struggles. The Rhine's meanders determined which bishoprics controlled lucrative ferry tolls until floods in 1385 left the Archbishop of Cologne's flagship monastery high and dry. His rival in Trier wasted no time, building new piers along the river's fresh path and declaring his own diocese the rightful steward of God's highway. The Pope eventually had to intervene, but not before armed monks from both sides brawled over docking rights. The holiest conflicts often revolved around water's most mundane trait, its ability to erase lines. When the Tagus River in Iberia shifted westward, it didn't just move the border between Christian and Muslim lands, it drowned the carefully placed boundary stones blessed by both imams and priests. Neither side could agree whether the old markers still held spiritual weight or if the river itself had drawn a new divine border. The resulting standoff lasted decades, with farmers caught in the middle pleading for guidance. Were their souls in jeopardy if they tithed to the wrong faith based on a river's whim? Perhaps the starkest lesson came from the Nile. Its annual floods were the pulse of Egyptian Christianity. dictating when Coptic monks could retreat to desert hermitages and when they'd be trapped by swamped roads. But when the river's patterns grew erratic in the 15th century, blame fell not on nature but on heresy. Church councils convened to debate whether God was punishing them, never considering that the river, like faith itself, simply followed its own mysterious logic. In the end, sacred waters proved the same lesson as secular ones. The land might belong to kings, but the currents answer to no one. Bruges was once the beating heart of Northern Europe's economy, a city so wealthy its name became synonymous with opulence. Venetian galleys jostled for space in its harbors, their holds bursting with silks from Constantinople, spices from Alexandria, and silver from German mines. But Bruges' golden age hinged on a single, slender thread, the Zwin River, the watery highway that connected it to the North Sea, and when that thread frayed, the entire tapestry unraveled. The Zwin's betrayal began quietly. Silt, carried downstream from farmland clearings upstream, started choking the river's mouth in the 14th century. At first, merchants barely noticed their ships still scraped through, even if the journey grew slower. But nature has a way of compounding small neglects. By 1420, the Zwin's main channel had shrunk to half its width, forcing captains to time their voyages around high tides. Then the unthinkable happened. A spring storm dumped a fresh load of sediment, sealing the harbor entirely for months. The city's wealth bled out faster than its leaders could react. Antwerp, once a sleepy competitor up the Scheldt River, pounced on the opportunity. Its deeper, more stable waterways became a magnet for desperate merchants. Where Bruges' docks now stood stranded like beached whales, Antwerp's wharves bristled with cranes unloading goods around the clock. The shift wasn't just about geography, it was about trust. Traders needed certainty, and a river that couldn't hold its course couldn't hold their loyalty. Within a generation, Antwerp's stock exchange became Europe's financial hub, while Bruges faded into a picturesque ghost of its former self. The economic shockwaves rippled far beyond these two cities. Hanseatic League merchants who'd built their northern empire on Bruges' wool trade scrambled to renegotiate contracts. Spanish bankers called in loans backed by now worthless warehouse inventories. Even the arts suffered. Flemish painters like Jan van Eyck, once patronized by Bruges' elite, followed the money to Antwerp's rising merchant class. The river's slow-motion suicide didn't just reroute ships, it redirected the flow of culture, power, and innovation. What made this collapse so devastating was its inevitability. Medieval engineers knew how to dredge harbors, but the Zwin's silting was a symptom of a larger crisis: deforestation upstream. As farmers cleared more land, rainwater carried unchecked soil into the river. Bruges could have saved itself by replanting trees miles away, a connection between ecology and economics that no one understood at the time. Instead, the city poured its remaining wealth into futile projects, like a doomed canal dug parallel to the dying Zwin. By the time they admitted defeat, even the rats had abandoned the warehouses. The cruelest lesson: Bruges' fate wasn't unique. Across Europe, from the dying ports of the Po Delta to the stranded wharves of England's lost river of Saarbrück, cities learned too late that rivers were more than just water. They were living partnerships. A harbor could survive war, plague, or even bankruptcy, but without a river's loyalty, no amount of gold could turn back the tide. Antwerp's triumph wasn't just luck, it was a warning written in silt and current, one that modern ports from Rotterdam to Shanghai still heed today. Build your fortunes on shifting waters, and one day they will shift away from you. Long before smokestacks and exhaust pipes, the Earth's climate was already writing its own brutal history, one that medieval rulers couldn't ignore. Between the 10th and 13th centuries, the so-called medieval warm period draped Europe in unseasonable heat, swelling rivers with meltwater from retreating glaciers. Viking settlers celebrated as Greenland's icy coast sprouted meadows, while English winemakers harvested grapes as far north as York. But this wasn't just a time of plenty, it was a geological upheaval in disguise. The Rhine, fattened by alpine snowmelt, burst its banks with such force that it redrew the border between the Holy Roman Empire and Burgundy, drowning disputed farmland until neither side could claim it. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, the opposite disaster unfolded. The Amu Darya shrank under relentless heat, abandoning the Khwarezmian Empire's irrigation canals just as Genghis Khan's hordes arrived. Climate, it turned out, had handed the Mongols their first weapon, a kingdom already crippled by thirst. Then came the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long snap of cold that arrived like a thief in the 14th century. Rivers that had been highways froze into jagged barricades. The Thames became a winter carnival ground, its ice so thick it supported ox carts and bonfires. But when spring came, the thaw brought catastrophe. Ice dams collapsed, sending walls of water crashing through villages. In the Netherlands, where dykes had held for generations, sudden floods drowned entire counties, their borders erased as thoroughly as if an army had raised them. The Zwin River, already choking on silt, now faced another enemy, prolonged droughts that left its channels too shallow even for fishing boats. Bruges' slow death wasn't just about sediment, it was about a world where the rains no longer came. The cruelest twist, these shifts didn't just change landscapes, they rewrote human loyalties. When the Danube's tributaries froze solid year after year, Hungarian shepherds drove their flocks south into Ottoman territory, desperate for pasture. Borders meant nothing to starving animals or to the soldiers who followed, sparking clashes over grazing rights that escalated into full-scale raids. In Scandinavia, the opposite migration unfolded. Norse colonies in Greenland, isolated by sea ice and starving as their farms failed, vanished into legend. Their last written record, a wedding contract from 1408 scribbled on parchment made from a driftwood log, the final gasp of a society climate left behind. Even faith bent to these changes. Pilgrims en route to Canterbury found their traditional ford across the Medway River now a treacherous marsh, forcing them to pay tolls at newly built bridges, enriching local lords who claimed divine sanction for their price gouging. In the Alps, retreating glaciers revealed passes unknown to Roman engineers, sending Swiss mercenaries pouring into Italy through routes that hadn't existed a century earlier. Wars, treaties, even the spread of the Black Death, all were shaped by waterways responding to a climate in flux, because when rivers moved, they didn't just carry water. They carried the fate of kingdoms. Medieval engineers wielded picks and shovels like generals leading armies into battle, except their enemy wasn't made of flesh and blood, but of water and sediment. Their grand projects to tame rivers read like cautionary tales, where every triumph of human ingenuity seemed to invite nature's swift and brutal reply. Take London's disastrous attempt to control the Thames in the 13th century. After centuries of floods swallowing entire neighborhoods, King Henry III ordered the riverbanks reinforced with stone embankments. But the engineers made a fatal miscalculation. They narrowed the channel to speed the current, not realizing this would amplify the water's fury during storms. The very walls meant to protect the city became battering rams, deflecting floodwaters sideways into the streets they were meant to shield. By 1290, half of Westminster Palace stood underwater after a single autumn storm, the royal court literally soaked by their own hubris. The Rhine offered an even starker lesson. In 1356, the city of Cologne spent a fortune building a massive weir, a type of low dam, to divert water toward its mills. At first, it worked beautifully. Then the river, denied its natural floodplains, began carving a new channel miles upstream, leaving Cologne's docks high and dry while drowning villages that had stood safely for generations. The weir's designer was last seen fleeing an angry mob of farmers whose fields now lay at the bottom of a newly formed lake. But the most spectacular failures unfolded in the deserts of Central Asia. The Khwarezmian Empire's vast irrigation canals, wonders of medieval hydraulics, collapsed under their own success. By forcing the Amu Darya to water endless fields, they starved its downstream delta, turning the Aral Sea's shores into salt flats. When Mongol invaders arrived in the 1220s, they didn't need to burn the kingdom's crops. The land was already dying of thirst. Centuries later, archaeologists would find abandoned water wheels half buried in sand, monuments to an empire that literally drank itself to death. Even well-intentioned projects could spiral into disaster. Venice's 15th century attempts to dredge the lagoon's silted channels accidentally punctured a subterranean salt layer, turning parts of the harbor so saline that shipworms normally kept at bay by the brackish water devoured entire fleets of trading galleys within months. The solution: importing Baltic timber treated with toxic mercury, which then leached into the canals, poisoning fishermen for decades. It was ecological domino theory in action, each fix creating 3 new catastrophes. The cruelest irony lay in how these failures reshaped politics. After repeated floods from botched dike projects, the Dutch developed a radical concept: the water board, where engineers answered to councils of farmers and merchants rather than noblemen. It was one of Europe's first experiments with representative government, born not from philosophy, but from the realization that rivers wouldn't respect the whims of kings. Meanwhile, in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella's attempt to straighten the Tagus River destroyed so much farmland that they had to compensate nobles with New World gold, accelerating colonial expansion. The ripple effects of medieval hydraulic failures reached across oceans and centuries, proving that when humans try to outsmart rivers, history itself changes course. Stories of sunken cities whispered across medieval Europe like ripples from a stone tossed into deep water, not just as campfire tales, but as coded warnings from a world where rivers could rise as swiftly as armies. The Breton legend of Wise wasn't mere fantasy, it was born from real terror. According to the myth, this wealthy port thrived behind towering sea gates until Princess Dahat, seduced by a demon, stole the key and unleashed the ocean. But peel back the supernatural layers and you'll find a haunting truth. Wise likely memorializes an actual coastal settlement swallowed by rising tides during the early Middle Ages. The story's details the drunken revelry, the ignored warnings sound suspiciously like a community caught off guard by storm surges as the climate cooled and seas crept inland. On the Baltic coast, the fabled city of Vinta met a crueler fate. Chroniclers described it as a Slavic Venice, its golden church domes shimmering above bustling wharves, until pride angered the gods and waves devoured it whole. Archaeologists now recognize Vinta as a composite of several Wendish trading hubs drowned by the Oder River's catastrophic floods in the 12th century. The myth's insistence that the city's bells still toll beneath the water isn't poetic license. It's an echo of fishermen's nets snagging on submerged church spires, their bronze relics dragged ashore centuries later with seaweed clinging to their cracks. These weren't isolated tragedies. Along the shifting Adriatic, the Roman port of Epidaurus sank so gradually that generations watched their ancestors' homes become fish nurseries, spinning tales of a city cursed for defying Neptune. In England, Dunwich, once a thriving Saxon port, slid into the North Sea cliff by cliff, its last church bell tumbling into the foam in 1926, as if fulfilling a prophecy written in 13th century chronicles. What makes these legends so chilling is their specificity. The Welsh story of Cantre Gwaelod names the drunken gatekeeper Seithanin, whose negligence flooded the kingdom, mirroring historical records of neglected dike maintenance in early medieval Wales. The real horror lies in how these stories evolved. As generations retold them, the human failures behind the disasters, poor engineering, deforestation, arrogant urban planning, morphed into divine punishment. A collapsing seawall became a princess's betrayal. A silted harbor turned into a merchant's greed. It was easier to blame gods than admit their own hands had shaped the catastrophe. Today, when divers touch the mossy walls of Wye's supposed remains off the Breton coast, they're not just exploring a myth, they're fingering the seams where history and helplessness stitched together a warning. Because rivers and seas have always been the most honest historians, preserving in their depths not just lost cities, but the unheeded lessons they carried down. The sound of a mill wheel creaking to a halt carried more terror than any war drum in medieval Europe. When rivers vanished or turned foul, they didn't just erase borders, they unraveled the fragile contract between lords and laborers. Take England's peasants' revolt of 1381, often remembered for its fiery rhetoric about freedom and taxes, but dig deeper and you'll find its roots in the chalky beds of dried-up streams. Villagers who'd spent generations grinding grain at watermills woke to find their livelihoods stranded in mud, while feudal lords demanded the same quotas of flour. No water meant no bread, yet the tithes kept coming, a recipe for rebellion written in parched earth. Germany's Bundscha uprisings followed the same deadly logic. In the Rhine Valley, where entire villages depended on fishing and milling, a decade of erratic floods and droughts left nets empty and mill races clogged with silt. By 1493, desperate farmers were nailing their grievances to church doors, not just against taxes, but against the abbots and nobles who controlled what little water remained. Their symbol, a laced peasant's shoe stained with the mud of fields they could no longer irrigate. When the revolts finally erupted, rebels didn't just storm castles. They targeted sluice gates and dikes, wielding scythes against the infrastructure that had starved them. The cruelest twist was how these crises amplified existing injustices. In times of plenty, a lord might overlook a family's shortfall, but when rivers failed, every bushel of grain became a matter of survival. Monasteries, supposedly God's stewards, often made things worse by charging fees for water access that had once been free. Along the Loire, records show monks selling blessed buckets of river water during droughts, while their own fish ponds remained mysteriously full. Small wonder that when the Jacquerie Rebellion exploded in France in 1358, the first targets weren't royal soldiers, but the millers accused of hoarding water rights. What made these conflicts so explosive was their intimacy. Unlike wars between kings where battlefields lay distant, water rebellions erupted in backyards and bread ovens. A Sussex widow might not care which noble won a border skirmish, but when her children's thirst drove her to smash the local bailiff's well lock, the fight became personal. Authorities responded with equal brutality after the English crushed the peasants' revolt. They executed men by drowning them in the very rivers they'd protested to save, a grim parody of justice. Yet even in defeat, these uprisings reshaped societies. The famous Statute of Merton in 1235, England's first environmental law, emerged from water disputes between landlords and tenants. Along the Danube, peasant victories forced nobles to guarantee water shares for common fields, and in the Alps, entire villages won the right to maintain their own irrigation channels, free from feudal interference. The lesson was clear. When rulers forgot that rivers belonged to everyone, the land itself could rise against them, because in the end, a kingdom's true border wasn't marked by stones or swords, but by the last place a mother could dip her bucket without begging. Rivers could be weapons far deadlier than any sword, and medieval commanders knew it. When the Mongol general Subutai laid siege to the Khwarezmian city of Gurganj in 1221, his engineers didn't bother with battering rams or siege towers. Instead, they rode upstream under cover of darkness and tore open irrigation canals, flooding the city's foundations until its walls dissolved like sugar in tea. It was warfare stripped to its cruelest essence. Why waste arrows on men when you could drown them with their own water supply? This wasn't just Mongol brutality, it was hydrological science. Across Eurasia, besiegers learned that diverting a river required fewer soldiers than storming gates. During the siege of Antioch in 1098, Crusaders secretly dammed the Oronce River, leaving the city's reservoirs empty just as summer heat peaked. Thirst drove defenders to drink sewage, weakening them long before the first ladder touched the walls. Even the Byzantines, masters of defensive warfare, fell victim when Ottoman sappers rerouted the Lycus River in 1453, turning Constantinople's protective moats into stagnant puddles beneath the shadow of Mehmed's cannons. But the most insidious attacks left no trace of human hands. At the Siege of Chartres in 911, Viking raiders didn't just poison wells, they dumped rotting carcasses upstream, letting the current deliver plague to every drinking vessel in the city. 3 centuries later, Timur the Lame used similar tactics at Delhi, stuffing canals with the corpses of his own prisoners to sicken the defenders. These weren't battles, they were silent assassinations carried out by water. The real masters of liquid sabotage were the Venetians. When Genoa's fleet threatened their lagoon in the 1380s, Venetian spies didn't sink ships, they sank rivers. By bribing Alpine guides to misdirect mountain streams, they starved Genoa's aqueducts dry, forcing the rival city to surrender or die of thirst. It was an early lesson in economic warfare. Control the water, and you control the fate of empires. Even failed attempts reshaped history. In 1529, Habsburg agents tried to divert the Danube to strand Ottoman troops during the Siege of Vienna, but their makeshift dam collapsed prematurely, flooding their own camp instead. The disaster gave Suleiman the Magnificent an unexpected advantage, proving that in hydrological warfare, nature always kept the upper hand. Whether through cunning or calamity, these liquid battlefields taught one indelible lesson. When kingdoms go to war, rivers don't just witness the fight, they become weapons in it. Frederick II of Sicily didn't need an army to conquer new lands, just a steady hand and a pot of ink. In 1241, when the Holy Roman Emperor demanded proof of his claims to disputed Lombard territories, Frederick didn't send soldiers or lawyers. He sent a map, a beautifully illuminated parchment showing the contested lands clearly nestled within Sicilian borders, their rivers and roads aligned with his version of history. There was just one problem. The map was a masterpiece of fiction. The rivers flowed where no water had ever run, the mountains stood where plains stretched for miles, and the borders followed lines no treaty had ever drawn. Yet for decades, that single piece of vellum dictated imperial policy, proving that in medieval geopolitics, a well-placed lie could be more powerful than 1,000 knights. This wasn't an isolated deception, it was standard practice in an age when maps were as much propaganda as geography. With no satellites or surveys to verify claims, rulers realized that controlling the parchment meant controlling reality. The infamous Vinland map, supposedly showing Norse settlements in North America centuries before Columbus, was likely a 15th century forgery designed to bolster Danish claims against the Hanseatic League. Its clever inclusion of wormholes matching those in authentic manuscripts gave it credibility, while its phantom coastlines quietly expanded Scandinavia's imperial dreams. The most audacious frauds often emerged from defeat. After losing Jerusalem in 1287, the Knights Templar commissioned maps exaggerating their remaining strongholds along the Mediterranean, making their retreat look like a strategic redeployment. The charts showed fictional castles perched on cliffs that didn't exist, their banners fluttering over valleys long lost to Muslim armies. These weren't navigational aids, they were fundraising tools meant to convince European nobles that the Crusades weren't crumbling. And they worked. Donations poured in from lords who'd never set foot in the Holy Land, their gold financing battles for castles that existed only on parchment. But map forgery reached its zenith in the hands of Alfonso V of Aragon. Facing rebellion in Naples, his cartographers produced two versions of the same territory, one for public display, showing loyal towns linked by sturdy roads, and a secret counterpart for military use, marking rebel strongholds with invisible ink visible only by candlelight. The dual maps let him play both statesman and strategist, pacifying diplomats with the fiction of unity, while his generals stalked dissidents through the hidden topography of betrayal. The consequences of these lies rippled far beyond royal courts. When Polish nobles used doctored maps to claim peasant farmland along the Vistula River, entire villages found their ancestral fields suddenly documented as noble estates. In Byzantium, a single altered harbor chart caused Venetian and Genoese fleets to collide in a narrow strait, sparking a war that outlasted the forgery's exposure. Even faith wasn't immune. Papal maps of the Holy Land, deliberately skewed to place pilgrimage sites under church control, led generations of devout travelers to pray at locations miles from where biblical events actually occurred. The ultimate irony, many of these forgeries became historical truth. Frederick II's fabricated borders were enforced so long that later treaties adopted them. The Templars' phantom castles eventually appeared in chronicles as real fortresses, their imaginary sieges recorded as fact, because in the end, the most enduring power wasn't the sword or the crown. It was the pen that drew the world as kings wished it to be, and the willingness of history to believe the ink. Imagine standing before a medieval court, not to accuse a thief or a murderer, but to sue a river. In 1345, the citizens of Cordoba did exactly that, dragging the Guadalquivir River before a magistrate for recklessly abandoning its banks and destroying their crops. The trial wasn't some peasant superstition, it was deadly serious. Witnesses testified, surveyors presented maps, and in the end, the river was found guilty. Its sentence, a forced redirection, with hundreds of conscripted laborers digging new channels to correct its path. This wasn't an isolated case. From the Danube to the Thames, medieval courts routinely treated rivers as legal persons capable of bearing blame, paying restitution, and even facing punishment. The logic behind these trials reveals a world-view where water wasn't just a resource, but a willful participant in society. When the Seine flooded Paris in 1296, the city didn't petition the king for aid, they indicted the river itself. Court records show the waterway was charged with trespass and destruction of property, with fines assessed based on the damage. Of course, the Seine couldn't pay, so the burden fell to those who profited from it. Millers, fishermen, and barge operators suddenly found themselves taxed as the river's guardians. This legal fiction created a bizarre form of environmental accountability, where those who relied on waterways became responsible for their misbehavior. Some cases took even stranger turns. In Germany, the Rhine was once placed under ecclesiastical censure, literally excommunicated, after persistent floods destroyed church lands. The Bishop of Mainz declared the river in a state of mortal sin, forbidding Christians from fishing or drawing water until it repented. It wasn't until engineers stabilized the banks that the ban was lifted, with the Rhine symbolically welcomed back into communion through a ceremony where holy water was poured into its currents. The most pragmatic applications came from water-sharing disputes. Along the Po Valley, rival villages regularly sued tributaries for favoring one community over another. Judges would order the literal redistribution of water, sometimes commanding upstream towns to build diversion channels or face penalties. These rulings functioned like medieval environmental regulations, using the fiction of river personhood to enforce fair usage. A 1289 case from Parma even records a stream being fined its entire flow for a week, its waters forcibly redirected to punish upstream farmers who'd overused it. But the system's darkest facet emerged when rivers were blamed for human crimes. After a child drowned in the Loire, 15th century courts in Tours charged the river with homicide. When no human culprit could be found for a miller's mysterious death, the local creek was convicted of witchcraft. These trials weren't just about justice, they were about control. By personifying waterways, medieval societies could impose order on nature's chaos, even if that meant pretending a river could repent. The real lesson. When your enemy is geography, sometimes you have to put the land itself on trial. The Tagus River played both sides in the medieval struggle for Iberia, a liquid double agent whose shifting currents prolonged the Reconquista for generations. For centuries, this winding waterway served as the de facto border between Christian Castile and Muslim Al-Andalus, but it was a border with a mind of its own. Unlike static mountain ranges or fortified walls, the Tagus didn't respect treaties or royal decrees. It moved when it pleased, drowning castles here, exposing new fords there, and leaving both kingdoms scrambling to adapt to its whims. Take the siege of Toledo in 1085. For years, the city's Muslim defenders had relied on the Tagus as a natural moat, its deep channels making direct assault impossible. Then came an unusually dry winter. By spring, the river had shrunk to a trickle, revealing a network of gravel shoals where Christian knights could cross unimpeded. The fortress that had stood impregnable for decades fell in weeks, not because of superior tactics, but because the river had quietly withdrawn its protection. Yet this wasn't a permanent victory. 50 years later, floods carved a new channel around Toledo's rebuilt walls, placing the city's eastern flank underwater and forcing Castilian engineers to construct an entirely new set of defenses. The river's betrayals cut both ways. Muslim chroniclers tell of the Alcantara Bridge disaster in 1211, when winter rains swelled the Tagus to twice its normal width. The floodwaters didn't just wash away the strategic crossing, they obliterated the very cliffs its foundations rested on, leaving Al-Andalus's armies stranded on the wrong side of a gorge that hadn't existed the previous autumn. Christian raiders exploited the chaos, launching lightning strikes across the newly formed gap before Muslim reinforcements could circumnavigate the river's new course. What should have been a minor inconvenience became a military catastrophe, all because the Tagus redrew the battlefield mid-campaign. Both sides learned to weaponize the river's instability. Castilian commanders developed a brutal tactic during droughts. They dammed the Tagus upstream of key Muslim cities, cutting off water supplies until defenders surrendered or died of thirst. The besieged would counter by digging secret wells or tunneling beneath the riverbed to tap underground channels, hydrological espionage that turned siege warfare into a battle of engineers rather than warriors. Meanwhile, Andalusian sappers became experts at triggering artificial floods by sabotaging irrigation systems upstream, drowning Christian camps with water that had been meant for olive groves. The war's turning point came not on a battlefield but in a surveyor's ledger. After the fall of Seville in 1248, Ferdinand III's scribes made a chilling discovery. Centuries of border treaties based on the Tagus's permanent course were now meaningless. The river had shifted so drastically that entire counties legally belonging to Castile now lay on the opposite bank, technically still under Muslim control. Rather than restart the war, Ferdinand ordered a radical solution: a comprehensive survey documenting every oxbow, ford, and sandbar, with borders defined by geographic features rather than the river itself. It was one of Europe's first attempts at scientific cartography, born from the realization that in Iberia, even the land couldn't be trusted to stay put. By the time Granada fell in 1492, the Tagus had become a symbol of the Reconquista's messy reality, a conflict where nature often outmaneuvered both cross and crescent. Its final insult, after centuries of favoring first one side then the other, the river's post-war stabilization allowed Ferdinand and Isabella to finally impose order only for their successors to discover that the newly tamed Tagus now deposited so much silt at Lisbon's harbor that Portugal demanded compensation. The watercourse that had prolonged a holy war for centuries now threatened to start a new one, proving that in medieval geopolitics, rivers didn't just witness history. They made it. The Volga River was supposed to be the Golden Horde's ironclad supply line, a liquid highway connecting the Mongol Empire's heartland to its conquered Russian principalities. But in the winter of 1374, the river committed the ultimate betrayal. It refused to freeze. For weeks, unseasonable warmth left the Volga's surface treacherously thin, its usual ice roads too fragile for the Horde's supply carts. Then, just as Mongol commanders adjusted to the delay, the temperature plummeted so suddenly that the river locked solid overnight, trapping entire convoys mid-crossing. Horses and wagons sank like stones, their precious loads of grain and weapons lost beneath the ice. It was a logistical nightmare, one that gave Moscow's Dmitry Donskoy the opening he needed to ignite rebellion. This wasn't just bad luck, it was climate warfare. The Mongols had built their empire on predictable seasonal patterns, counting on the Volga's reliable freeze to move troops and tribute between Sarai and Novgorod. But the Little Ice Age's erratic weather shattered that certainty. Some years, the river froze too early, stranding merchants who'd gambled on extra autumn trips. Other winters brought false thaws, luring travelers onto seemingly solid ice that collapsed underfoot. Russian chronicles tell of Totter tax collectors vanishing into Polinia's mysterious gaps in the ice where warm springs bubbled up, their frozen bodies surfacing leagues downstream come spring. The chaos reached its peak during the Great Standoff on the Ugra River in 1480. As Muscovite and Mongol forces faced each other across the waterway, both sides waited for winter's freeze to turn the river into a battleground. But the ice never came. Week after week, the Ugra flowed stubbornly open, its currents churning with an unusual warmth that baffled shamans and priests alike. Without a frozen crossing, the Horde's cavalry, the terror of Eurasia, was rendered useless. Supply trains stalled, morale crumbled, and when the Mongols finally retreated, it wasn't because they'd been outmaneuvered, but because a river had rewritten the rules of engagement. What made the Volga's betrayal so devastating was its ripple effect. The Golden Horde's power relied on perception, the illusion of invincibility that kept vassals in line. But an empire that couldn't command its own rivers, that was vulnerable. Within decades, splinter khanates emerged along the very waterways that had once united them, their warlords blaming Sarai's incompetence for the ecological chaos. Meanwhile, Russian princes turned the Volga's moods to their advantage. Ivan III's spies tracked ice patterns like military intelligence, timing revolts to coincide with thaws that isolated Mongol garrisons. By the time the Horde realized their greatest weapon had become their greatest liability, it was too late. The currents of history had already shifted. The cruelest twist, the Volga's treachery was never personal. Its freeze cycles followed solar minima and ocean currents, not human politics. But in the medieval world, where nature and power were inextricably linked, a river's indifference could topple thrones just as surely as any army. The Golden Horde didn't fall to swords or siege engines. It fell to the quiet, relentless work of water and winter, proving that even the mightiest empires bow to the land beneath their feet. Paris owed its survival to the Seine's serpentine curves until the day the river straightened its back and left the city naked. For centuries, those looping meanders had been nature's fortress walls, forcing Viking longships into exhausting detours that gave defenders precious time to rally. Attackers had to row against the current, navigate hairpin turns under arrow fire, and risk grounding their shallow drafts in ever-shifting sandbars. It was a perfect defense until the Seine decided it was tired of bending. The change began subtly. Winter floods in 862 scoured the riverbed near the Isle de la Cité, carving a shortcut across the base of a wide loop. At first, Parisian sentries barely noticed just a few more inches of current here, a sandbar forming there. But within a decade, the Seine's main channel had abandoned its old oxbow entirely, shearing off miles of protective twists. Where once Viking raiders had to navigate a labyrinth, now they could point their prows straight at the city's heart. The river's betrayal was so complete that when Rollo's Northmen returned in 885, they sailed unchallenged to the very gates of the Grand Chatelet, their oars dipping in water that hadn't flowed there since Roman times. Paris scrambled to adapt. King Odo ordered new towers built along the streamlined banks, but stone couldn't replace the lost geography. The river's old loops, now stagnant backwaters, bred malaria-ridden mosquitoes, while the faster current undermined freshly built quays. Even the fish changed. Salmon that once teemed in quiet eddies vanished, leaving markets empty and monks grumbling about meager Lenten meals. The Seine hadn't just abandoned its course, it had rewritten the city's ecology, economy, and defense in one fluid stroke. Yet the cruelest twist came decades later, when the river's old channels became weapons against their former protectors. During the siege of 910, Viking warbands used the abandoned oxbows as secret highways, dragging longships overland to re-enter the Seine behind Parisian barricades. What had been a shield was now a backdoor, its dried-up bends offering raiders concealed paths to strike the city's undefended flanks. The very geography meant to safeguard Paris had become its Achilles heel, all because water follows gravity, not kings. By the time Rollo's descendants became Normandy's dukes, the Seine's fickleness was legendary. Their sagas told of the river as a living adversary, one that had both thwarted and aided their ancestors. Later medieval engineers, desperate to prevent another betrayal, tried shackling the Seine with stone embankments, but the river always had the last laugh. In 1212, a flood burst those very walls, drowning the Louvre's storerooms and floating the crown's tax records all the way to Rouen. A fitting revenge for a city that had dared to think it could outmaneuver nature's oldest strategist. Nixies lurking in German mill ponds weren't just fairy tales, they were ecological alarms in disguise. These watery spirits, said to drag careless children into the depths, emerged from a very real terror, the moment a village life-giving stream turned into a cracked mudflat. Across Europe, folklore about vanishing waters served as ancient hazard signs, passed down through generations like oral maps of danger zones. The Slavic Ruzalka, often pictured combing her hair on moonlit riverbanks, wasn't merely a spooky campfire story. Her mournful songs mirrored the cries of farmers watching their irrigation channels dry up. her presence a supernatural explanation for droughts no one could yet understand scientifically. These myths often pinpointed actual hydrological disasters. The Welsh legend of Cantre'r Gwaelod, a sunken kingdom swallowed by the sea, likely preserves folk memory of coastal erosion during the early medieval warm period. Irish tales of the Hag of Bera weeping until her tears carved valleys may encode ancestral observations of flash floods scouring landscapes overnight. Even the Norse myth of the world serpent Jörmungandr, whose thrashing caused tidal waves, could reflect Viking encounters with tsunamis triggered by underwater landslides. What modern scientists might call climate change or sedimentation patterns, medieval storytellers framed as capricious spirits or divine punishments, different languages describing the same environmental crises. The most haunting water spirits were those tied to human folly. Eastern European villages spoke of the drowning mothers, ghosts of women who died in floods, now doomed to warn others by appearing wherever rivers were about to burst their banks. German miners told of kobolds poisoning wells after forests were clear-cut upstream, a poetic indictment of how deforestation disrupted watersheds. These weren't random horror stories, they were moral lessons wrapped in metaphor. A Rusalka's vengeance against men who polluted her stream mirrored very real communal punishments for those who fouled shared water sources. Some myths even offered survival instructions. Finnish tales described the Neki, a shape-shifting water demon that avoided certain deep pools, likely marking hidden springs or dangerous whirlpools. Scottish Selkie legends often placed these seal people near coastal caves where freshwater seeped through rock, guiding sailors to vital drinking spots. The terrifying Hungarian Vizazurn, a flood dragon, always emerged from specific mountain passes exactly where sudden snowmelt cascaded down in spring. By turning geographic knowledge into supernatural lore, communities ensured children would remember critical locations long before they could read maps. The tragic irony, many warnings went unheeded. Breton fishermen continued overharvesting despite the tale of the Groke, a hag who emptied nets to punish greed until their fisheries collapsed. Saxon villages ignored stories of the wassermen drowning those who took too much water, only to exhaust their aquifers during droughts. These myths weren't just records of past disasters, they were prophecies waiting to repeat. Today, hydrologists study medieval folklore as an unexpected archive of climate data, finding correlations between spirit sightings and tree ring evidence of megadroughts. The ghosts of lost rivers still whisper if we're willing to listen. The Black Death didn't just empty villages, it unleashed rivers. As the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, it didn't merely decimate human populations, it unraveled centuries of hydraulic engineering, turning disciplined waterways back into forces of chaos. Across the continent, canals choked with weeds, dikes crumbled from neglect, and floodplains reclaimed lands that had been painstakingly drained. The pandemic's true toll wasn't just measured in graves, but in the sudden rewilding of landscapes that had been shaped by human hands for generations. Take the Netherlands, where entire provinces slipped beneath the waves. Before the plague, intricate networks of windmills and dikes kept the North Sea at bay, transforming marshes into fertile polders. But when half the dike repair crews perished in 1348, the sea found its opening. Winter storms breached weakened barriers, flooding farmland so thoroughly that some regions remained underwater for decades. The Zuiderzee, once a manageable inland lake, expanded into a saltwater menace, swallowing villages and severing trade routes. What had taken generations to build was undone in a handful of storm seasons, not by conquest, but by the absence of hands to hold back the tide. Further south, the Po River in Italy reverted to its ancient wanderings, For centuries, monastic orders and city-states had meticulously canalized its flow, directing water to mills and fields. But with monasteries emptied by plague and laborers dead in their beds, the river shrugged off its constraints. By 1352, chroniclers described the Po's delta as a nest of serpents, its once straight channels splintering into a maze of silt-clogged tendrils. Ferrara's merchants watched helplessly as their harbor, already struggling before the plague, became a stagnant backwater, its docks rotting in the mud of a river that no longer visited. The most dramatic transformations unfolded in England's fens. These vast wetlands had been steadily drained since Roman times, creating rich pastures and grain fields. But when the Black Death wiped out the communities maintaining the drainage ditches, water came rushing back. Villages built on dry ground found themselves marooned as islands, their church bells tolling mournfully over newly formed lakes. The returning wetlands brought an unexpected twist. As croplands vanished, so did the rats that had thrived in granaries, possibly slowing subsequent plague outbreaks. Nature's revenge, it seemed, carried a strange mercy. Even rivers untouched by engineering felt the plague's indirect hand. With fewer farmers tilling fields, soil erosion plummeted. The Rhone in France and the Tiber in Italy ran clear for the first time in centuries, their waters no longer clouded by runoff from overworked slopes. Fish populations rebounded as fishing pressure eased, and migratory birds reclaimed wetlands no longer drained for pasture. For all the human suffering, the Black Death offered Europe's waterways a perverse renaissance, a chance to reset boundaries that had been fixed not by nature, but by the sweat of vanished generations. The cruelest irony lay in the aftermath. As survivors rebuilt, they often found the land itself had moved on. Dykes they'd known since childhood now held back nothing but air, the rivers having carved new courses miles away. Canals their fathers had dug now drained phantom fields, their purpose as forgotten as the names on plague stones, and when lords tried to reimpose old water taxes based on pre-plague maps, they faced revolts from peasants tilling unrecognizable landscapes. The Black Death hadn't just killed people, it had killed the very geography they'd lived by, leaving survivors to navigate a world where even the rivers refused to stay where they were buried. Satellite images don't lie, but they do reveal secrets medieval mapmakers never could have imagined. Today's archaeologists aren't just digging in the dirt, they're scanning the Earth from space, using infrared and LiDAR technology to spot the ghostly imprints of rivers that vanished centuries ago. These aren't just faint lines on a screen, they're echoes of entire ecosystems, hidden beneath fields and forests. Take the case of England's lost river of Sorbrook, long dismissed as a folk tale until thermal imaging exposed its ancient bed snaking beneath a modern parking lot. The real shock came when sediment cores pulled from the site matched 12th century monastery records down to the year, proving the monks hadn't been exaggerating when they described a waterway wide enough to float a barge. Sediment cores are like time capsules for hydrology. By drilling deep into floodplains, scientists can read layers of silt and pollen like pages in a ledger, tracing exactly when a river changed course or dried up. Near the Loire Valley, cores revealed something startling: a catastrophic flood in 1321 that permanently rerouted the river, drowning entire villages overnight. Local chronicles had blamed the disaster on divine wrath, but the sediment told a different story, evidence of deforestation upstream that destabilized the banks. Suddenly, a medieval tragedy became a warning about environmental mismanagement, echoing across 7 centuries. The most dramatic corrections are happening in the world of cartography. For years, historians dismissed the Hereford Mappa Mundi's depiction of a massive river bisecting France as pure fantasy, until satellite surveys proved it was the long-lost channel of the Somme, a waterway that vanished after the Black Death depopulated the maintenance crews keeping it clear. Similarly, Arab geographer Al-Idrisi's lost tributary of the Nile, mocked for centuries as a fabrication, turned out to be an ancient branch buried under Sahara sands, its course perfectly preserved in radar scans. These discoveries aren't just setting the record straight, they're revealing how much our ancestors actually knew about landscapes we assumed they misunderstood. But the real game changers are the rivers that shouldn't exist. In Germany's Black Forest, Loire uncovered a network of medieval canals so extensive it rewrote the history of the region's economy. These weren't natural waterways, they were purpose-built by monks to float timber to construction sites for cathedrals like Strasbourg's, proving medieval engineering was far more sophisticated than we imagined. Meanwhile, in Cambodia, aerial surveys of Angkor Wat's surroundings exposed a sprawling grid of reservoirs and canals that functioned as a hydraulic metropolis, complete with neighborhood water towers. These weren't just rivers, they were the lifeblood of civilizations we're only now beginning to comprehend. The irony, some of these lost rivers never actually disappeared, they were erased. In central Spain, documents from the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella describe a vibrant trade route along the Guadiana River. By the 18th century, maps showed it as dry. Modern drilling revealed the truth. Spanish engineers had deliberately plugged its springs during the Reconquista to starve Moorish strongholds of water, then covered their tracks with misleading surveys. It's a reminder that rivers don't just vanish by accident sometimes, they're silenced. Nowhere is this more poignant than in the Arctic, where melting permafrost is exposing Viking-era river channels that haven't flowed since the medieval warm period. These icy ghosts are rewriting the history of Norse expansion, proving settlers followed waterways now buried under tundra routes modern archaeologists can suddenly retrace thanks to climate change. The bittersweet lesson, the same forces that hid these rivers for centuries are now, tragically, bringing them back to light. As satellites peel back layers of time, we're left with a humbling realization: the land remembers what empires forget. The Colorado River's dwindling waters today mirror the crises medieval kingdoms faced, except now, satellites track every disappearing drop instead of monks recording omens in parchment margins. Modern borders etched by colonial treaties assumed rivers would stay put, but like the Loire or the Po, they have other plans. The Nile, source of 90% of Egypt's freshwater, now sparks tensions as Ethiopia's Renaissance Dam throttles its flow downstream, a 21st century replay of Burgundian dukes sabotaging rival towns by diverting the Scheldt. Even the Rio Grande, the legal boundary between the U.S. and Mexico, keeps shrinking, leaving border patrols and farmers arguing over land that was underwater when treaties were signed. What medieval rulers learned through blood and silt, modern governments are discovering with sonar and lawsuits. You can't legislate nature. The Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan, hailed as a diplomatic triumph in 1960, now strains as glaciers retreat and rainfall patterns shift. Ancient conflicts echo in these disputes, like when the shifting Danube left Hungarian and Ottoman forts useless. Today's hydroelectric dams and irrigation canals become geopolitical pawns. Bolivia and Chile's century-old feud over the Silala Springs hinges on the same question that doomed medieval Ferrara. Does a river belong to those who claim it, or to the land it chooses to flow through? The most urgent lesson lies in the maps themselves. Medieval kings doctored parchments to suit their claims, but modern satellite imagery leaves no room for such tricks, only harsh truths. When the Mekong River's course alters, exposing islands claimed by both Cambodia and Vietnam, Drones and GPS replace swords and scrolls, yet the stakes remain unchanged. The Aral Sea, drained by Soviet cotton projects, now exists only on outdated atlases, its dusty bed a warning sharper than any monk's chronicle. Borders drawn against nature's will are written in sand. Perhaps the final irony is technological. Medieval engineers lacked the tools to predict or control rivers, but their failures forced adaptation like Dutch waterboards or Hungarian floodplain treaties. Today, we have the science to foresee crises, yet still repeat old mistakes. Arizona and California's water wars ignore the Colorado's ancient rhythms, just as Castilian nobles ignored the Tagus' wanderings until their farms became another kingdom's ports. The difference: medieval societies collapsed when rivers abandoned them. Our interconnected world risks cascading collapses, where a drought in Brazil spikes coffee prices in Tokyo, or a dam in Turkey empties Iraqi wheat fields. The ghost of Bruges whispers to Las Vegas, no empire, however wealthy or wired, is immune to a river's betrayal. When the medieval Zwin silted up, it bankrupted a city. When the Colorado's reservoirs hit dead pool, it could paralyze continents. The past offers no solutions, only a stark reminder: water honors no flag, recognizes no border, and bows to no power but its own. The choice isn't between claiming rivers or surrendering to them, but between learning from history or drowning in its repetitions. The story of lost river maps isn't just medieval trivia, it's a mirror held up to our own fragile illusions of control. Those vanished waterways whisper a truth we've ignored for centuries. Borders drawn by kings, treaties, or armies are nothing more than temporary scratches on a surface that nature will always erase. Think of the Po River casually transferring entire duchies between rulers, or the Danube rewriting battlefields overnight. These weren't anomalies, they were the land reminding us who's really in charge. Today, as climate change melts glaciers and parches riverbeds, we're facing the same brutal lesson, only now the stakes are global. The Colorado River's shrinking flow has turned Western U.S. states into modern-day Burgundian dukes squabbling over water rights. The Nile, once the unshakable backbone of empires, is now a tense bargaining chip between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. Even the Mekong's shifting course sparks naval standoffs in Southeast Asia. History isn't repeating itself, it's shouting through a megaphone: adapt or collapse. The irony: medieval societies often understood rivers better than we do. They lacked satellites, but they respected water's whims. When the Rhine abandoned its channel, Dutch merchants didn't just rebuild, they reinvented their economy around the new route. Hungarian shepherds displaced by the Danube's freeze cycles didn't deny climate shifts. They migrated or dug deeper wells. Their solutions were imperfect, but they acknowledged reality. Meanwhile, we pump aquifers dry and pour concrete over floodplains, pretending the rules don't apply to us. Here's the uncomfortable truth hidden in those faded maps: every border we draw is borrowed. The treaties that divide nations, the deeds that define property lines, they're all temporary arrangements with an earth that never stops moving. The Black Death's survivors returned to find rivers that had reshaped the land in their absence. What will we find when today's crises recede? This isn't doom mongering, it's a call to rediscover flexibility. The Catalan Atlas's secret warnings about shifting sandbars, the Venetian spies who tracked alpine streams, these weren't just tactics. They were a mindset. Rivers don't care about our politics, but they will dictate our future. The question isn't whether we'll heed history's lessons, but whether we'll do it before the water runs out or rises over our walls. Hit like if you believe in learning from the past, and subscribe to keep exploring the forces that shape our world, because the next great border shift might be flowing toward us right